the things which I'm going to talk to you about this year are things that I know much less about than usual. That sounds more vain than I meant it to be, but this is a theme in which Nietzsche is a theme which I have greatest interest, but which I really have studied less adequately than anything else. I mean, the reason why it's not only that I have interest in Nietzsche, I do think that Nietzsche is one of the very small number of authors who are most important. It's certainly the author, the modern author, most important for us. I mean, both because of the profundity of his analysis of our situation, and also because Nietzsche is us. I mean, the overwhelming influence of Nietzsche on everything in our life really has to be. Oh wait, hello, Fame.
Hi.
How are you? No, Fred and so on are out there, so I'll wait till they. Yeah. I thought the sort of I thought it was Zarathustra cottage cheese, which is about what I would expect.
You can't speak.
I'll have some Last Man cola. Yeah, I think I should wait for Fred to come in. Maybe, or is he?
Fred's getting cheers. I think.
Here's the chair right here.
Thank you. You've used that one before, haven't you? That Last Man cola.
No, I just made that up.
You saw it?
Yeah, brilliant, huh? Yeah.
Plural.
Hello, Fred. How are you? Good to see you. Yeah, the only thing that isn't done in houses now is smoke. No, it's nice to know. I mean, the last refuge of the moral instinct. It's the only thing I do. Yeah. That Nietzsche is the most powerful intellectual influence on our times in ways that everyone is really unaware of. I mean, the degree to which it has penetrated daily life, so that it has come to seem American common sense. So much carried, for example, by German sociology in the United States. Words like lifestyle and so on, which are really new words, or just the use of the word value. That's all Nietzsche. And so Nietzsche, in a way, is immediately recognizable, but it's so recognizable that it's alien. It's necessary to think through what the consequences of Nietzsche are, or what the use of this Nietzschean language means for, what the consequences of it for our life. And somehow, I think for our own activity of self-consciousness, the study of Nietzsche is central. Now, you're going to be teaching this to students, and it is particularly difficult to teach Nietzsche, and I'm going to talk to you about, in large measure, from the teaching aspect. By the way, in terms of the sessions, I think we'll spend both sessions today on Nietzsche, tomorrow morning on the Dostoevsky, and the Eliot Wasteland, tomorrow afternoon on Antony and Cleopatra. Yeah, that is the proper organization. The problem with teaching Nietzsche to American students, there are two opposites. In one sense, it doesn't mean a thing to them and they'll pay no attention to it. In another, or certain kinds of students will go wild about it in a quite dangerous way. Nietzsche's rhetoric, and this, of course, is one of the problematic aspects of Nietzsche, is such as to make anybody feel significant, and hate the world around them, easy, kind of easy sense of transcendence, significance, and so on. One of the things that was very striking as a teacher during the 60s, when many students had mental breakdowns, it was a very regular aspect of life. I mean, one doesn't see it as much. I suppose perhaps the proportion of psychiatric difficulty remains the same, but there was a kind of evidence of it in the 60s. And the number of students for whom Nietzsche was the material, practically every student who would come into my office, having some kind of paranoid or schizophrenic episode would be citing Nietzsche in one way or another, and it was quite striking. So but the greater difficulty, aside from the psychiatric difficulties, it hasn't taken it seriously. The theme is nihilism that we're going to discuss today, from the will to power. And I just don't believe, I think the nihilistic experience, perhaps not nihilism in its deepest sense, but the nihilistic experience is really alien to Americans. We're an optimistic people, and this year I taught a course at Chicago. Saul Bellow and I teach a course, sort of literature, and we decided to do nihilism in modern literature. And one of the books we read was Ferdinand Céline's Voyage to the End of the Night, or Journey to the End of the Night. And the students, who of course claimed that they had all the nihilist experiences after reading, the first part of Nietzsche, of course, were just appalled by it or bored by it. The Céline book, and it might be valuable to try to stick that into one of your courses just to see what the reaction is. I mean, sometimes you ought to put books in just to test the intellectual temperature of your students. It was a combination of, it seemed, intensely boring and also horrible. And of course, the fact that Céline became a Nazi, or if not really a Nazi, certainly, some kind of nihilist who could sympathize with, even with the extremes of fascism, was always as a cloud for them, a kind of combination of moralism plus why can't you have more loving relations? If you've read Voyage to the End of the Night, the hero is a man named Robinson who is willing to die for not saying, or for die, let his girlfriend shoot him because he refuses to say he loves her. He just wouldn't take that. Refused to subject himself to that. And of course, this is an object of admiration for Céline, the narrator, who felt that this man really believed in something that was worth dying for. He would have said he loved her. But it was down to this level. Now, I believe that the Céline books are the only, or among the only, I don't know that literature very well, plausible characterizations of the nihilistic mood in literature. When you read somebody like Gide, of course, that's just show off. To show how shocking he can be. It's pour épater la bourgeois. He's obviously still very excited by life and by fame and so on, and a few other things. With somebody like T.S. Eliot, it's just an excuse for a certain kind of snobism. In higher people, it's a kind of despair based upon great longings for higher, for old grand cultures. But in Salim, the experience that it is really all over, which is supposed to be of the essence of the nihilist experience, is there, and the students simply didn't go with it. Whereas in France, young people, I think, understand it immediately, recognize its greatness, and so on. And I attribute this something to kind of real American belief in happiness, the right to happiness, that things will work out, and that all this high intellectual criticism that comes from Europe is simply a way to make our life better. I was thinking that, well, the supposed Woody Allen claims he saw a book in a bookstore saying the categorical imperative and 6 ways to make it work for you. And that's an American, and it's in some sense nihilism, for the greater fulfillment of your life, where you can imagine self-help books of that kind. That it is extremely alien, but at the same time, there is no doubt, that the teaching itself has enormous effects on America. On the one hand, and at the same time, it is descriptive of something that's going on, and there's in the souls of Americans, American young people, but without a prise de conscience, without being fully conscious of it. It is quite extraordinary that the language of Nietzsche, and it's always a question of wonder to me, has had this enormous success in America, much more so perhaps than any place in the world, or at least we were the first. Here you took America, which was simple, common sense, positivistic, and all of that world, beginning with values, lifestyle, charisma, which wasn't Nietzsche's term, but which Weber developed around certain Nietzschean ideas. You can't find a janitor in America who doesn't use the word charisma now. Now, that really is quite astounding. And when you think of all that word carries with it, it implies that leadership comes from something like divine grace, but which really isn't divine, and the undemocratic implications of that. You see that, of course, the whole terminology was developed to say that, of course, democratic rationalistic legitimacy doesn't work, and therefore the critical thing to concentrate on is something like charisma, which we, of course, immediately degrade into public relations. But in a way, we get the central idea. On the one hand, we, by turning it into mere public relations or an act or something like that, anybody who yells loud enough is said to be charismatic. In a way, we continue the democratic revolution, which Nietzsche was trying to, or the democratic progress, which Nietzsche was trying to stop. But at the same time, we undermine its vital, spiritual, intellectual core. Am I being clear in that? Because the meaning of democracy was that men rationally could subject themselves to laws that they make themselves, with rulers who are themselves reasonable, that a union of reason. And of course, this whole language denies that. And you see it in the word lifestyle, again, of a Weberian notion, which came from Nietzsche, that of course the good way of life is not what one seeks, because there is no such thing as the good way of life. There is no intellectual intuition of the ends of man. There are artistic makings of life. Now, of course, anybody has a lifestyle. Today, there's well, I mean, I don't have to go through the different varieties. There are as many as quirks or perversions of people, but but again, the crucial point is gotten. Quest, sort of a philosophical, rational quest for the right way to live is not necessary, but what it is a kind of expression of artistic forming of the unconscious drives. I am still so astounded by the degree of success of this dark German side of the soul, which was as alien as anything could be, to American directness, empiricism, common sense, how it captured America. Now, I mean, it had to respond to something in our souls, and it's really, worth reflecting on. But I was with a taxi driver in Atlanta. I mean, in the sense I was in his driving in his cab, and he told me he'd just gotten out of prison, and he had gotten in contact with himself. Again, that language, the language of the self. Again, which is essentially Nietzschean in character. He got in contact with himself, and he had done all kinds of therapy. And I said, well, what kind of therapy did you do? He said, well, I did depth psychology, transactional analysis, but what I liked best of all was Gestalt. Now, I mean, if you think what that means, what was the high expressions of German philosophy, now, in the same way that one has a suppository, I mean, it's and so in some sense you can say, well, it's part of our genius for incorporating everything and making it democratic, and that's kind of nice, personality, creativity, commitment, all these things which were meant to be aristocratic notions. Very few people could really be creative. Few people could have personalities. People who could set their own values. Those were the activities of genius. In a way, that's what Nietzsche is trying to restore. And restore is over against, say, on the one hand, democratic mediocrity, but also against rationalism. And now those things become available to everybody. That's marvelously American. But at the same time, the degree to which it alienates from both common sense, the democratic, simple democratic character of our lives, which we're supposed to be, work and family, and taking care of the country and ourselves, but somehow the opening up of an enormous dark region of the soul, but opening it up, without any assurance that there is, a great continent there, or that great continent, will not do terrible damage. It's that, as I say, easygoing, happy. Nihilism for Americans would be connected with the right to happiness, as I suggested. And that's the whole mood of nihilism. And it is a mood. It's supposed to be a sort of temper of the soul. You say there can be no happiness. What they do is they take the despair and then say, we'll cure it by a therapy. That mixture. It's very, very odd. And it's very central to American life. Let me even say that in one sense, this is the world described by Nietzsche that was going to come, but it's also a world which has been transformed by Nietzsche. And that's the reason why Nietzsche is both important, interesting for us to watch in its effect on students, but also dangerous. I'm going to begin by reading over a passage of Nietzsche's that is not from this book. And by the way, this book, I don't know why you chose The Will to Power, because it's really not a book. I mean, and you're going to have some considerable problems whether you're going to have to go through and just pick out the aphorisms. They are, I mean, Nietzsche as Nietzsche from the very beginning. I mean, in all of his writings is, of course, extremely difficult, elusive, somehow expecting a certain kind of cultivation on the part of his readers, which we no longer have, and which he, doesn't point to. It's not like the problem of Kant. I mean, Kant is difficult to read, but he tells who his sources are. He always speaks to universal reason, and although perhaps to understand the real meaning of Kant, you have to know a whole world. There is a meaning that is simply the universal meaning conveyed by reason, but Nietzsche is so much appealing to a common experience, which of course at the same time he's trying to preserve. You can say that experience, and I think that has to be pointed out to the students, is the experience on the one hand of classical antiquity, particularly the Greeks, and above all Greek tragic poetry, but also Plato, and on the other, the experience of the biblical religions, Judaism, and particularly, of course, Christianity. And he implies a deep knowledge of, a deep sympathy with, and also a struggle against those two roots. And both have had a tendency to disappear. In a way, we've solved the problem of the tension. Nietzsche describes our soul as a kind of bow, with two ends which is very difficult to string, but the string has an enormous tautness, and it is out of that bow that one will project the new values that he hopes and expects that man will be able to set for himself. And of course, you can say part of the American educational way has been to unbend the bow, again, to use a Nietzschean expression, by just not giving us that information any longer. This is, by the way, I mean, in a private way, I'd like to hear from some of you about this. As a teacher, over the years, I always, when I began teaching, I said, well, Americans don't know anything. I didn't know anything when I was 18. And you begin tabula rasa, it's a wonderful thing. But I didn't realize how much they had in them, just sort of instinctively, from their old religious training, certain kinds of family relations, and so on. And my feeling has been that this has been going down year by year, so that there's almost no bow whatsoever to begin with, or that the soil is very thin. That this has been the problems of education, that the past longings. Let me say, in this context, one of the things that's very striking is that I'm finding that a disproportionate number of good students now are Catholic, or at least of Catholic training, because they seem to carry more of the past. I mean, frequently just the mere reminder that a bad conscience brings, but which it can be a stimulus, to serious education. But the will to power is a very great problem because of the difficulty of Nietzsche's writing in general. And here he is. It's not a completed book. It's very hard for the teacher himself to figure out to what he can attribute to what he can say is really serious, developed, what the real intentions of the book are, and so on. Of course, there are many wonderful things in it, wonderful observations, but again, this is a problem because the most wonderful observations of Nietzsche are psychological observations, psychological in the broader sense, the possible states of soul. And he was marvelous in describing, characterizing the phenomena that go on. Well, young people, and particularly our young people, don't tend to be very subtle analysts of their experiences, their moods. They're told what they feel. They have the categories given to them, in large measure. So one has to turn them to it. But I wanted to begin with the famous passage, and it might be useful for you as teachers to do so, for the last man passage from Zarathustra, because it, in some sense, states the beginning point. Perhaps I should say the following. I mean, I had meant to say this in my in remarks, that I think part of the success of Nietzsche in the United States has come from its assimilation into Marxism. You see, the great movement. I mean, Nietzsche is clearly a right-winger, if you forgive that crude formulation, but it is important that one recognize that, because Nietzsche is so elusive that one has to stick on things that are really clear and which they will understand. We'll come back to this, but he's against democracy, he's against notions of human rights. Above all, and perhaps this would allow for some of the best discussion in class, if when the best one means most heated, he's absolutely against the equality of women, feminism. He regards that as absolutely essential. I mean, I'll try to explain why, and there's some good remarks in here that one can refer to. Nietzsche is that he is a figure who said, modernity, and modernity means democracy and ultimately socialism, is on the one hand the decadence of man, necessarily the decadence of man, and leads to, or is not really leads to, but is the true expression of nihilism, the real belief in nothing, and that it is the deepest and perhaps fatal misunderstanding of the nature of things, and hence particularly of man. And it is one of the great achievements of the left to have incorporated Nietzsche, because if you hear Nietzsche talk, I think you'll see it's mostly on the left today. That's been since the Second World War. The whole school of criticism called deconstructionism is nothing but that, an attempt. You see, deconstructionism, I mean, in the simplest sense, it's a circus act. You cut the woman up into pieces, the magician, and then you put her back together. That's that's what they do to Nietzsche. They cut him up, put him back together, and he's a leftist after the circus, after the circus act. And I think the simplest way in which Nietzsche moved to the left, Nietzsche's description of modern man, which is very impressive, can be easily assimilated to Marx's understanding of the bourgeois. It's much profounder, obviously. You can say, well, Nietzsche says this is the last man, this is what we are heading to. Marx says, no, this is a stage, we're going to get beyond it, after the revolution. And this has allowed the left to, at least to make a plausible case, because this is a description of the men of our times, and that's the bourgeoisie. That's what we have to get rid of. You see, and that would, much more easily allow for the revolution. And precisely because Nietzsche is a much profounder describer, spectator of man than Marx, and takes much more seriously the intimate experiences, which somehow the economic explanation does not. Without the Nietzschean element, Marx, how should I say, without the Nietzschean element, I think that Marxism would have died completely. That the appeal of contemporary Marxism is the appeal of Nietzsche. And I think you find that in the Frankfurt School, Habermas, and so on. That there is, and that began really with Lukács and so on a long time ago. It's been a continuous thing that these people were smart enough to recognize where the real intellectual force was and somehow to incorporate it. I mean, I'm not saying that it was a propaganda stunt. I mean, I think they were convinced Marxists who didn't want to think it through, but for whom Nietzsche posed great problems, and they somehow took that in. And I think, of course, that has a great deal to do. The refugees from Hitler, the Frankfurt School, spent a long time in the United States, 20, 25 years, and they were extremely effective. But for example, what the kind of charm of Marcuse, I mean, if there is any charm, is precisely that, a Marxist analysis of the present, a Nietzschean hope for the future after the revolution. Nietzschean, was somewhat banalized or vulgarized into Freudianism. Another way of speaking of the power of Nietzsche in the democratic world is he allows for the excitement of sort of plaything, of the democratic world. I mean, it would be so boring, if there weren't these kinds of expectations. So in a way, he becomes a kind of opiate of the democratic man, if one likes it. This was in a way Nietzsche's objection to romanticism. That romanticism, which was in a way a very splendid thing with very great men, who had who opposed mediocrity and materialism in the name of art, but that very soon, as those of you who know Madame Bovary, a man like Monsieur Homais, who's the bourgeois quintessentially, uses the bohemians, and will have their paintings, and read their poetry and so on after dinner. And that in a way Nietzsche suffers some of the same fate, that he in a way gives the needed supplement to a certain life. By the way, I would very much appreciate, since my presentation is both very incomplete and halting, and because I would like your notions. I know there are people here who know Nietzsche much better than I do. For example, Ernest. I would, appreciate your just interrupting, to ask questions or to state your opinions about this. But the Last Man is a very good beginning point. Zarathustra, who is come down from his mountain among men, finds that he can't attract them by descriptions of the Superman, and he says, well, all right, now I'm going to discuss them. And it is his educational technique in describing Last Man is to describe a human being who is absolutely revolting, and to arouse their contempt. Now, that human being ultimately is supposed to be a mirror, which they see themselves and have self-contempt. But in some sense, we can repeat that activity in reading this to them. They have something of which they are proud. What do they call that which makes them proud? The education, they call it. It distinguishes them from goatherds. That is why they do not like to hear the word contempt. Apply to them. Let me then address their pride. Let me speak to them of what is most contemptible. But that is the last man. And here his beginning point, of course, is modern education. And he doesn't mean to say modern education is criticized by the Reagan administration, but modern education as it was known in Germany, which is very much an admired thing. Modern scholarship, modern academic philosophy, history, natural science, and so on. Bildung, bourgeois education as was represented in the high period of the German university. The time has come for man to set himself a goal. The time has come for man to plant the seed of his highest hope. His soul is still rich enough, but one day this soil will be poor and domesticated, and no tall tree will be able to grow into it. Alas, the time is coming when man will no longer shoot the arrow of his longing beyond man, and the string of his bow will have forgotten how to whir. Incidentally, I wonder what students will get from that. Do you think it'll mean anything to them? And I think one must give some kinds of explanations in this context. And I mean, behind it, of course, lying all of this is the simple but powerful Nietzsche formulation: God is dead. And of course, God was what caused men to do extraordinary deeds in the past, and therefore, and without God, man will have no goal of aspiration. And the purpose of any serious thought, according to Nietzsche, is to reestablish goals, which means to say something which men can respect, esteem, or can value, and that, of course, is the beginning of the understanding that the good and bad. That formulation should be replaced by value. The notion that a value is something something that's valuable, something that we esteem. And what has happened is we have lost the objects of esteem. It's worthwhile asking students what they esteem these days. They all say they esteem something. And I think in general you'll find they esteem being open, which means to say having no esteem. They esteem open people, or they esteem certain kinds of very abstract notions. And Nietzsche puts it in the Will to Power section that morality has become abstract. People who have really nothing to do with their lives. Gandhi, would be a perfect example of abstract moralism. As opposed, say, to Athenians' attachment to Pericles, or an American to George Washington at the time, of the Revolution, or immediately afterward. With a group of students, I always say these things just to get reactions from them. What do they? One kid said, "Well, what's wrong with my not having any heroes? As a matter of fact, I do have heroes. What's wrong with Mick Jagger being my hero?" And he said, "That's not so bad, because you see, they still are moralistic while trying to be free. I also have other heroes." I said, "Who?" "Jesse Jackson and Cardinal Bernardin." And I said, "Well, they're all three on the same level." That is no way to denigrate the Cardinal, or Jesse Jackson either. But they are largely, like Mick Jagger, media creations. This kid had never heard of Cardinal Bernardin before the nuclear freeze movement. 3 months before, and the nuclear freeze movement itself had that character of abstract moralism. And why are they for the nuclear freeze movement? So we can have peace, and then we can have absolute freedom to do whatever we want. That's the there's no. I think that's the inner content. Nietzsche says here, "I say unto you, one must still have," a very important formula, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. I say unto you, you still have chaos in yourselves. Now, this formula, of course, as is always with Nietzsche, Nietzsche, very important atheist. His observation of modernity is that men no longer really believe. That's his assertion. It's finished. Now, whether that is simply true is another question, but that is the beginning assertion, the beginning observation, and therefore, but the difference between Nietzsche and atheism is, as you know very well, and say Marxist atheism is that Nietzschean atheism is characterized by longing for God. It's, you can say, religiosity without religion, Or, the formula is very simply, God is dead, meaning to say he wants to get existed, meaning to say there were beliefs that were compelling enough so that men could believe in it. That God was once again compelling, and that made life possible. The loss of God is catastrophic from Nietzsche's point of view, and in the characterization here, chaos. Of course, what he does is he puts into man what we know from the Bible. I mean, if God was to be creative, or to create the universe out of nothing, it was obviously out of a chaos. Otherwise, God was not free. Nietzsche argues that for man to be creative, if the word is to mean anything, there must be chaos. And chaos means to say that which is not guided or organized by any rational principles, which one can get no light from reason. And in some sense, it is this chaos that Nietzsche, in some sense, is trying to cultivate. And one has to recognize, you see, the notion of creativity as being a good thing, everybody has accepted. The notion that chaos is a good thing, people have not accepted it. But the question is whether the two are not, necessarily connected. And what chaos means, of course, is violence, brutality. Chaos means no principle of peace. Reason means the possibility of peace, ordering, at least in principle. Chaos, and you see, Nietzsche argues, of course, that chaos, that creativity, growth, means to say war among men, subordination, enslavement, rebellion, overcoming. A kind that the underlying experience of man who really faces his situation, and the man who's going to be creative, is in the first place chaos. And he said, you still have chaos in your soul. The implication is there is the tendency of modernity has been to take away the chaos. Well, why shouldn't one take away chaos? Well, his argument, of course, is that it is not really taking it away. It is a superficial covering over of the fundamental situation, a kind of hopefulness, but a low hopefulness. And the will to power, of course, is just the notion. The will to power is, of course, just another expression for chaos. An active chaos. That's as opposed to just lying flat and doing nothing. You see, of course, the whole notion of the unconscious, which Nietzsche did not invent, but to which he gave a new meaning, was, of course, the source of the chaos. The unconscious is opposed to the conscious. If your students know Descartes, which they should by this, the rational consciousness of the modern scientific method is merely a little island or a little boat floating on the unconscious, which is meant to be a correction of Descartes. The whole notion, of course, the absurdity of what came immediately after, which again was a democratic understanding. Yes, we do have this chaos. We have the unconscious. Everybody agrees there's such a thing as unconscious now. There's, when I was a kid, or when some of you were kids, that was a very controversial thing. But now it's absolutely certain. But at the same time, we think, well, science can understand the unconscious. We see how absurd that is. I mean, if the unconscious is really chaos, then science cannot possibly grasp it. And the difficulty with that, is that, that, of course, that is, even from a Nietzschean point of view, much worse than people who don't believe in the unconscious, because in unconsciousness, the source of violent but creative experiences, great longings, if it can really be exhausted by reason, then, of course, the last, reason itself would take on a ragged and irrational air, but at the same time, that world would be tamed. It could be subject to order. And so Nietzsche here is speaking in the name of chaos. Alas, the time has come when man will when man will no longer give birth to a star. Alas, the time of the most despicable man is coming. He that is no longer able to despise himself. Behold, I show you the last man. And what is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? Thus asks the last man, and he blinks. I don't know whether you've noticed this. I just became, students never use the word love anymore. I mean, they'll use brotherly love or something like that, but love for what they now call interpersonal relations. It simply is not used, and it's a striking. There's they have a good relationship, hell, but what does love mean? A very dangerous abandon, in particular, a form of possession, or a desire to be possessive, and hence connected with that possibilities of jealousy, anger, all of those distorting phenomena, which have become particularly problematic within feminism, or in the relations taking place under in the new dispensation of feminism, and that would not have been a surprise to Nietzsche, because Nietzsche would take with that which is understood to be the struggle, and the fullness of, well, to use the Nietzschean language, commitment. See, commitment is, of course, another Nietzschean word. The crucial thing, of course, is what you put into it, not so much what it is. The objective content of the ends is gone, but it is the attachment to the thing that counts. And of course now, again, that word has become democratized too. I made a commitment to my girlfriend for at least 2 years. But the language is there, and commitment means precisely irrational, total dedication, idealization, and so on. And Nietzsche took the sexual revolution, which he saw very clearly coming, the sexual revolution and feminism, as a mode not of serious expression of formerly repressed passions, but as a way of domesticating, taming the erotic passions. Which when you read Plato, they're connected with madness, all kinds of dangerous activities, and so on. Or if you read romantic novels, the heroes are not only losing all their money, but their lives and good reputations, and so on. Enormous risk, and sexual liberation makes it possible not to have those risks, or another, to use contemporary language, when they talk about coming out of the closet with various things, the notion is that they have some kind of, enormous tiger or lion roaring in there, but sort of swelling the door, and then you open up, and a little tiny mouse walks out, you're fairly easily satisfied, it doesn't, I think anybody who looks at the student generation today, this is certainly not Dionysus, although they have, I think he's said to be merely resentful, but they certainly have, satisfactions of, what was previously denied. The tremendous importance of longing in Nietzsche, longing. Now, Nietzsche, of course, begins with a critique of longing. We'll see this in the various remarks he makes about romanticism. But what was wrong with the Romantics? I mean, not that they, in a way, preferred longing to any of the satisfactions that were available. It was that ultimately they were too passive. They didn't recognize that man could create the objects of longing. But we will come back to that. But you can say the possibility of self-contempt and the experience of longing. Those are the two things which are, most lacking. You see, this entire description of the last man is a description, a mere factual description, and a very impressive one, a very powerful one. But it is against the background of these facts that one recognizes that there must be something wrong, that these facts themselves teach it. I mean, after Nietzsche, there arose the distinction between facts and values. Facts and values was based upon, of course, Nietzsche's articulation that values are the most important thing. But Nietzsche says, obviously, even those who would say, because he didn't live to see it, those who made the fact-value distinction recognize that the values are what guide life. And if you have made it impossible to have values, if values have become undermined, and the instrument that creates values has been undermined, then you can factually say that man is no longer man. That the ambience in which man lives has been polluted or destroyed. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? The earth has become small, and on it hops the last man, who makes everything small. His race is as ineradicable as the flea beetle. The last man lives longest. We have invented happiness, say the last man, and they blink. They have left the regions where it was hard to live, for one needs warmth. For example, they moved from Chicago to Santa Fe. Yeah. One still loves one's neighbor and rubs against him, for one needs warmth. Now, you see what he's thinking of the Christian experience. Now, Nietzsche, says elsewhere that to love one's neighbor was an incredibly difficult self-discipline in the history of the soul, because one's neighbor is disgusting, and unattractive. Well, that's what it meant. That one's neighbor is a being. It was a being to despise. Not only an enemy, but something to be hated. Yeah, and now we have succeeded in so taming the soul that that's no longer a commandment that's necessary. It's what people long for. To have harmless people to be around. I think that was the genius of Woodstock. You remember, a few years ago, this is a great achievement. You didn't need the police or anything. And just there was a great burst of love. And one is constantly looking for that. In group experiences. Becoming sick and harboring suspicion are sinful to them. One proceeds carefully. Have you heard the expression? Again, this is another one of the successful things. My taxi driver out to the airport to coming here was saying, "Well, we're all beginning to get paranoid, and now, of course, that's the thing, paranoid. Yeah. Now, what does Nietzsche say? And of course, paranoia is clearly a disease. You shouldn't be paranoid. Yeah. Is the opposite of paranoid laid back?
Laid back heavy.
But becoming sick and harboring suspicion are simple. See, as Nietzsche's whole understanding is, because men do not fit together naturally. The suspicion. But you see, it becomes a disease. And it's a fool. Whoever still stumbles over stones are human beings. A little poison now and then. That makes for agreeable dreams, and much poison in the end for an agreeable death. He's talking about modern medicine. One still works, for work is a form of entertainment. But one is careful lest the entertainment be too harrowing. You constantly see that. Of course, I have my work, but hobbies. One no longer becomes poor or rich. Both require too much exertion. Who still wants to rule? Who obey? Both require too much exertion. No shepherd in one herd. Everybody wants the same. Everybody is the same. Whoever feels different goes voluntarily into a madhouse. Psychiatry, which is absolutely universal. Formerly all the world was mad, say the most refined, and they blink. What does that mean? So supposed to say, I mean, who says we say all the world is mad? Well, I think everybody does say all the world is mad. We've all read history. Everybody, world history. And weren't all past ages mad? There were slaves, there were kings, and it doesn't. I don't think there's a single student who reads, the history of England, the history of Greece, who doesn't say that was crazy. That's wonderful. You got to know history. You got to be open to things and so on. But they're not open to those things because they know that was crazy. I mean, the latest transformation of history, if not transformation, transformation of the way we even characters viewing history, is as a history of the enslavement of women, which means to say that it was all crazy up to now. I talked to a young theologian this morning who says that that's what they teach even in Catholic seminaries, that it was a cultural error, the role of women within the church, and that means to say our historical knowledge is really a history which ends up praising ourselves, how much wiser we are, how we have seen through the errors of the past, and connected with that self-praise, the whole historical movement has culminated in this awareness: is the most contemptible human being. I mean, Hegel, of course, already knew this danger of history, of the historical mood. But when he said that every German lycée, a gymnasium professor, teaches that Alexander the Great conquered the world because he had a pathological love of power, and the proof that the teacher does not have a pathological love of power is that he has not conquered the world. We have set up standards of normalcy while speaking of cultural relativism. That's but there is no question that we think we understand what cultures are and the kind of mistakes they make. We are all in favor of having many different cultures, but all those cultures must really do the same things we want. This is the the enormous. See, Nietzsche says, of course, you have to have cultures. And that's a Nietzschean contribution, and a tremendous amount of anthropology has been based on Nietzsche and so on. But Nietzsche says, in order, if you have really different cultures, you have to have in some places slaves, harems, that's part of it. And everybody was in a way in favor of the Ayatollah, not everybody, but a tremendous number of Americans were in favor of the Ayatollah before he came to power. Then they're just furious at him, what he's doing to women. But that's a culture. Culture, it's really different. But the idea, there was more cultural difference in the United States when I was a child than there is in the whole Western world today. Real cultural difference in terms of real difference of life. When there was segregation in the South. I remember they were like from a different world, and that wasn't even slavery. We've lost sense of the meaning or the possibility of real differences. It's either something we're for in a sentimental way as culture, or that we become horrified by. And it is really very interesting. The Iran situation is one of those things where our intellectual incoherence, and that intellectual incoherence is the sign, the symptom of nihilism, according to Nietzsche. They were against the Shah for two reasons. One, because he was, a tyrant. The other, because he was too universal, too westernizing. He was trying to impose Western. That was one of the things, Western things. And then some people were for the Ayatollah, and the Ayatollah is culture. That really is a representative of the old Iranian or Muslim culture. But at the same time, he's denying human rights. Which means to say the Ayatollah has no right to have a culture, because a cultural difference. Precisely, a true cultural difference rather than eating egg foo young or corned beef. mean a thing. I mean merely residual effects. Real culture means difference precisely about what the rights of man are. Nietzsche says here, and you can understand what he says, that there are no rights which men have not conquered. I mean, Nietzsche is absolutely marvelous for, in terms of teaching, for getting students, on the one hand, to recognize that they believe in Nietzsche, and at the same time to be absolutely shocked by Nietzsche because he's against what they believe in. There's not one who doesn't believe in creativity and in the dullness and the drabness, of modern life, and who doesn't believe in culture and rootedness and so on, who doesn't think it's important to be committed and have values, and at the same time they're all universal scientific Democrats. It's a profound incoherence, which is, I think to any observer, outside observer, something that is a pathology, because it means to say that nothing really serious, in terms of arranging one's priorities, which again would be a Nietzschean formulation of the way of doing things, but arranging one's priorities is absolutely impossible. And all you have to do is look. Again, Nietzsche talks about this, and we see it again expressed in our times. The fantastic tension, although I think unrecognized, between ecology and, I'm going to say directly, aspects of feminism. Ecology says nature is good, we shouldn't touch it with the thing, and then we have to produce drugs, to control birth, and that's an improvement, freedom. It's on the one hand a subordination, to assume that nature is good, and on the other, man's freedom, man's freeing from nature, and the two groups belong to the same political party, and actually, they tend to go together. I think feminism and ecology are very frequently linked. But my impression is that in terms of the convictions underlying, they are contradictory. One is clever, one knows everything that has ever happened, so there's no end of derision. One still quarrels, but one is soon reconciled, else it might spoil the digestion. There can't be quarrels, at least from our point of view, which lead to serious war. And that's the reason why, again, another, similar incoherence. Some of what affected by self-organization, but a similar incoherence. Peace everywhere, in favor of wars of national liberation. Same people. And it's not merely that we're in favor of wars of national liberation, so there won't have to be any wars. There's a deep admiration for people who are committed enough to die for something, but we don't have any reason to do it. One has one's little pleasure for the day and one's little pleasure for the night, reading and sex, but one has a regard for health. We have invented happiness, say the last men, and they blink. And the crowd shouts, "Give us the last man, Zarathustra." Now, this is Nietzsche. There's very, very much, in a way, the whole of Nietzschean thought can be, or at least in a very large measure, drawn from this passage. But it's the center of it. I don't want to debase the meaning of this, but somehow the goal of the welfare state is what he meant by Lawson. Not the welfare state as it is, but the goal of the welfare state. Sweden, improve, which has attracted, of course, the admiration of certain kinds of people for a long time. Now, Nietzsche wants to begin with the horror of this. Now, you can say that this is too low, it's merely political, and so on. But for Nietzsche, of course, the world is one, and that, of course, what man is, and this is particularly true for Nietzsche, more so than for earlier philosophy, what man is in his political setting is a reflection. It is first the beginning of where we have to begin in order to understand what being is. And our particular problem comes from this particular pathology. And in some sense, a certain kind of political transformation is the ground, a political observation is the ground for the new philosophy, and a political transformation is the ground for the health of man and for the preservation of the human, as well as for the enhancement of man's highest activity, which is philosophy. Therefore, Nietzsche is on the right. He's not a conservative by any manner of means. That's perfectly clear. And he's not a capitalist. He's not a bourgeois. You see, when one reads Nietzsche from a particular parti prise, if one is a leftist, one can find things, about the distorting character of our society, which are very appealing. If one is a rightist, one can say, against democratic egalitarianism, very appealing. If one is in favor of classical philosophy, one can see that he recognizes the importance of community, order of rank, the aristocracy of the soul, and so on. But of course, he is none of those things. I mean, he, in a way, touches all the bases, but he's not a classic. He's different from the classics in that he is anti-speculative, which was the central aspect of classical philosophy. He's not a rightist in any sense, or in ordinary sense of the word. He's a profound revolutionary. He's obviously not a leftist because he sees that the principles of the left are merely the extension of the principles which most people are trying to, well, not most people, but some people are trying to conserve in conservatism. It's an attempt at a new beginning, which is a transformation of the soul of man, as well as of his politics, but that requires follows from this observation. And in some sense, if you can't get your students to take this observation seriously, you can't take you can't get them to take Nietzsche seriously. Otherwise, they'll just be speaking words. If they don't feel somehow that this is an object of contempt, and that they are somehow, and they wouldn't be normal in any way if they weren't somehow like this, because this is certainly the element of our time, and what is most valued. Now, one can easily say to Nietzsche, these things are values, and that's of course what he says. Modern science is really just a value. Modern politics is just another value. But they are values that don't take seriously what it means to be a value, so they aren't values that will work, will hold a society together. Another passage from Nietzsche, perhaps I ought to say simply try to say what nihilism is, and then I'll read the passage. One is simply that there is nothing to esteem, nothing that compels us. We have seen through it all. And he says that, of course, there were a lot of socialists who hoped for a better world. There were people who believed in democracy. What he said is those were all weak beliefs. He claimed that the scientists themselves, I'll go through some of it later, but everything in our life reflected a self-irony. Even there were some people, of course, he said, who in some sense faced the issue. You found this in philosophers like Schopenhauer, pessimism. You found it in writers like Baudelaire, Flaubert, it's all over. Nothing, no human activity has a support or a ground. Everything, is necessarily illusion, but illusions which can't be, which cannot work any longer. They once worked. I mean, you can say this was the great expectation of Romanticism, Rousseau's contribution. Of course there were illusions, artistic, creative illusions. That's what the past was, and we can have new ones. That's what Beethoven, Schiller, that's what Goethe. But in the generation immediately succeeding, that if those are merely illusions, they will be sucked back into the ugly reality. And nihilism is that experience of groundlessness, and expressed in the formula, one can't believe in gods any longer, and once there are no longer gods, there's nothing else. But that the scientists themselves don't really believe in science as an understanding of the world. On the other hand, but there is, I think, another sense of nihilism. I mean, there are three. There are three kinds of nihilism. There's Nietzsche's own nihilism, which, of course, is a positive, life-enhancing response to the other form of nihilism, one can say, to the despair of nihilism. But the other sense is, of course, an anarchy of values. Not that there are no values, but an anarchy, which means to say that none of them can work in the forming of a life. By the way, another terminology which comes from Nietzsche is role-playing. Modern men are actors. And now this is just taken for granted. Everybody speaks of his roles. So it's another terminology, another language of sociology that has succeeded. I mean, the greatest, you can say, genealogy or theogony of Nietzsche's thought, speaking of Nietzsche, Max Weber, and a few others, to the succeeding school of sociologists, and then brought to the United States and spread by sociology departments. And what does it mean to say if you've got a role? Role as a woman, role as a man, role as a teacher, role as a citizen. You're an actor. You put on a costume, and you yourself know that that's only a role, and roles can be changed. And of course, the real man, according to Nietzsche, recognizes that if he has roles, if they're only roles, then they're not worth it. They're not real. And so either the insight that it's nihilistic despair about it, or a man who really can be what he is and unify all the aspects of his life. That was what was meant by the notion of personality, which was introduced by Kant and so on in 50 years before Nietzsche. And Nietzsche concentrated on the artistic character, and he claims that all men today have a certain kind of irony, but which they try to escape, they try to cover over. The deeper men see it, but the irony is caused by this. I mean, his anarchy of values, and he states that they're really very good. We call this is a list of opposite values most men hold today. We call good someone who does his heart's bidding. but also the one who only tends to his duty. You see, I mean, there are two kinds of people. People who live their lives freely and self-expressively. And then there are those, the Kantian moralists, who are always subordinate themselves. We call good the meek and the reconciled, but also the courageous, unbending, severe. I mean, you have to look in yourself in each case. I mean, I think we recognize the charm of both sides. Yeah. We call good someone who employs no force against himself, but also the heroes of self-overcoming. We call good the utterly loyal friend of the true, but also the man of piety, one who transfigures things. I think, each of us can find moments when we're on both sides. Scientist who says, I won't believe anything, and then somehow in the atmosphere of a true believer, each has its charms. We call we call good those who are obedient to themselves, but also the pious. We call good those who are noble and exalted, but also those who do not despise and condescend. We call good those of joyful spirit, the peaceable, but also those desirous of battle and victory. We call good those who always want to be first, but also those who do not want to take precedence over anyone in any respect. And that's a fair list, I think, of something that operates today. And of course, if you look at them, you'll see that they are just Jerusalem and Athens. I mean, to say one is the Greek and the other is Christian. We call good someone who does his heart's bidding. That's somehow Greek. Also, when he tends to his duty, that's somehow Christian. We call good the meek and reconciled. That's Christian, but also the courageous, unbending, severe. That's Greek. We call good someone who employs no force against himself, but also the heroes of self-overcoming. It's a little more complicated. Good, not a loyal friend of the true, but also the man of piety, and so on. I think that is more revealing, the second understanding of nihilism. Not to say that the two are obviously connected, but more revealing, of the way we actually experience nihilism. That we have a medley of values, and none of them can be said to be the highest. What does Heidegger do? I just took this out of the Heidegger line. That's from some unpublished. There's no longer any goal in and through which all the forces of the historical existence of peoples can cohere, and in the direction of which they can develop. No goal of such a kind, which means at the same time and above all else no goal of such power, that it can by virtue of its power conduct man, or Dasein, to its realm in a unifying way and bring it to creative evolution. By establishment of the goal, Nietzsche understands the metaphysical task of ordering beings as a whole, not merely the announcement of a provisional whither and wherefore. You see the point we have lost. And as a matter of fact, this is, what is the critical thing? Man is the esteeming being. What does he esteem? He esteems values. Now, of all the words of this whole, panoply, this whole lexicon of new words which really dominates American thought and which come from Nietzsche, the central one is value. And of course that's what Nietzsche is. The will to power is a preparation for the establishment of new values. This poses a question. Is there any longer any place in the university where the foundation of values can be studied? How would you see? It's become we have accepted completely this understanding. Really accepted completely. I think practically everybody uses the word value, for talking about good and bad. I say practically everybody. I think it's even those who think they shouldn't. And it's an amazing thing, this instinct, because it's an instinct that has come to being in the last 40 years. If you look at it was in the 30s in the United States, it was a kind of inward among intellectuals. In the 20s, not at all. And it's only since the Second World War that it has become popular jargon. And I would always think that a change in a word is connected with a fundamental change in the way we are, a change of an important word. And everybody says values are terribly important, you've got to have values. But what do we do about it, and what can we do about it in our education? Anything? I mean, I think just enough, right? Despair about it. You know, there's no science for that. You know, everybody has to establish his own, and how we go about doing that. So a kind of continuing recognition there's nothing to do about it, there's no ground for them, but the absolute centrality of values. Now, I mean, I don't know whether that makes any sense, but I mean, where do they? I mean, there is no doubt that Americans, there are very powerfully held values in America today. A very small number. One of them is anti-smoking. But I think they are almost exclusively of the kind anti-racism, anti-elitism, anti-sexism. By the way, elitism is another word that comes out of the Nietzsche. You know, I mean, you say that people who are on top were chosen by some kind of almost mysterious religious process. You know, not by hard work or by force, or you know, or by reason. That's another word that comes from that Nietzschean sociology. But anti-elitism, anti-racism, anti-sexism, I think those are the only. You see, and there's no question that egalitarianism remains an enormously powerful tendency in America. And well, I mean, perhaps but somehow as taken for granted, as connected with somehow establishing a world in which everybody can have his own values, even though these values are imposed upon us. It's an extremely strange thing, and of course they are not taught. I mean, you don't have to prove that a man shouldn't be, or a woman, I mean, a human being shouldn't be a sexist, shouldn't be a racist, shouldn't be an elitist. There's no proof of those. That's just our ethos, it seems to me. And beyond that, the questions are not of the don't belong to the domain of serious study. Somehow we agree about values. The whole notion of values came from a new philosophical articulation, which we don't study anymore. That new philosophical articulation leads to a sort of impotence in relation to values. Now, you see what's characteristic of our times is, of course, not immorality. I mean, there may be a lot of factors, but I mean, everybody wants to be moral, much more so than, say, for example, when I was young in the 50s, the thing was to be tough. You know, you had to the sort of Machiavellian social science. But now everybody wants to be good. And there is a pervasive soft moralism around. That is one of the greatest impediments to students' learning, in my experience. Unwillingness to accept some of the harder aspects of morality, but at the same time, as I suggest, this sense of groundlessness and a sense of these are only values, there's nothing we can do about it, and a kind of absolute. Well, I mean, how do they go about in theology schools, for example, or establishing religious values now? Well, what do they do?
Well, it's partly what they don't do. I think you're right. It's a question of the foundation of these values. It's very difficult even to discuss other topics. Many times in our sessions.
Isn't there a remnant?
Accepts the ethos.
Isn't there a remnant in people who want to defend anti-sexism or anti-racism? Isn't there a remnant of some standard of nature that they have recourse to? These people, I don't mean the sophisticates who immediately would say there's no way of establishing values, but I mean the ordinary person, and even the ordinary passionate defender of this or that cause, I believe would have recourse to an older standard. And say, well, look at the nature of the races. They're essentially alike. Well, look at the men and women, aren't they essentially alike? I think that would be the way in which they would think about this and argue it.
I wonder if that's simply true. I mean, there is something of that. There is a sort of simple naturalism in all these things. I think maybe this afternoon it might be desirable to, take some of the things on feminism in Nietzsche altogether. But I think both things are within feminism, as I see. With racism, I think that the standard was, on the one hand, sort of traditional Americanism, something like that. All men, have certain kinds of natural rights and so on. With feminism, I mean, there was that element, but it has moved backwards and forward because there are a whole series of problems. One is the overwhelming weight of history, which is against feminism, which therefore has to say, well, either history was a mistake, or the second thing, of course, is the physical differences in childbearing, and of course so essential to feminist arguments is that, of course, in order to preserve the species, we had to have this medicine. It's only in the last 50 years that we have medicine that has changed, to this degree, the survivability of children. I mean, the children don't die anymore, very, very rarely die of diseases, whereas 100 years ago, 50% still died, or really at 75, and so that meant to say the women had to be much more child bearers if there was going to be preservation. And secondly, the means of preventing conceptions, on which are scientific and obviously somehow a conquest of nature, that movement is much more has greater difficulties to face. And so you find both things. One is that it's nature, and the other is freedom of choice, which means to say that nature has to overcome and be overcome. But both of those elements, I think, are there. That's the you see, we maintain the same goals, but our ground shift constantly about them. I think people will be absolute relativists when it comes to questions of international relations or sexual tastes and so on, but they'll be relative absolutists or perhaps absolute absolutists, when it comes to questions of racial, sexual, generally egalitarian rights. And that's what's so curious about, our moral condition. And I'm not, here I'm not taking a position on any of the particular things. It is the enormous difficulty of, coherent grounding, which is, you say, well, perhaps they were always poorly grounded, but in our time, because there's so much intellectualism around, and I do think this has this effect, and I'm very struck by the ease with which people change their positions. I mean, that accounts for, people who were liberals becoming fascists. I was very struck, in my experiences in university, students who were always for freedom of speech, easily giving in to committed students who wanted to stop freedom of speech. And what happened there? I mean, they admired the commitment, the strength, whereas they themselves weren't really sure their liberalism, I think underlying, and this is what Nietzsche says, and of course what Nietzsche tries to teach us to live with, is that there is intellectually relativism. Now, but that relativism serves certain kind of moral needs, which are the egalitarian needs. So therefore, they will. Nietzsche seemed to say that these two things were co-evil. They really happened at the same time. that relativism, which means you couldn't believe in anything, and I'll talk about the various forms of it, but it is simply relativism, and Nietzsche, of course, accepts that relativism. And at the same time, the last man, with the goals of the welfare state, we would say, as a kind of absoluteness, but he would say that in a way that absoluteness can only come from relativism, because nobody would choose that if he had real values. Something of that kind, that it's a kind of end of man, comfortableness of man, and that is the very powerful instinct. And then relativism, which sort of destroys all the other values as its instrument, the instrument of that instinct. So it's now maybe Nietzsche is wrong about what is articulation of nature and so on, but I don't really see nature. In fact, there's a lot of talk about nature today, but what they mean by nature is not what Nietzsche meant by nature or what Plato meant by nature. What it meant by nature is dead nature without man in it, and which says very little. And of course, and the very characteristic of the relationship to nature is not only dead, but contempt for man. You see on practically every one of these PBS shows about nature, this was before man came and polluted, Porpoises are nice people, they don't do what man does, they don't have wars, and they don't invent smokestacks, and so on. This is just a continuing rhetoric throughout the entire thing, a denigration of man on the one hand, a denigration of reason. But on the level of mere feeling, because you see, our relation to nature, nature is good because we feel good in nature. It's a kind of end of man